Could I ask you a question, Scott? First, I'm not sure you used the word triage, but it certainly sounded like that's what you were talking about. And is that the kind of era that we're in right now, where we have to accept that some things can't be saved?
Yeah, I'd agree. So one of the issue comes down to we have limited resources and ability to conserve or maintain some of our species, perhaps woodland caribou being one of them. And at some point, do we invest those conservation dollars to try to do something where we probably have a low chance of success and triage that, and instead concentrate some of the conservation dollars to things we can save? So I think that it'd be quite controversial, but that is possibly some of the next phases of discussion in conservation.
Wow. Yes, question.
My question from the back is for Scott, and it's about the measurement of climate velocity.
Sorry.
So what I understood is you measured climate velocity independent of the movement of the rare species, but do you have an idea about how to do exactly the inverse by building baselines from movement of species? Because they don't always move because climate change, right?
Yeah.
Geography, geology, and other things. Do you have baselines that help support the idea that your climate velocity measures are accurate enough to optimize to the experiments you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the climate velocities that are described in those slides assume that a species needs to maintain a climate equilibrium, but that is an assumption. An alternative is in situ adaptation. So you'd adapt in place, and that climate itself would not be necessarily a limiting factor. So this is perhaps an exposure type variable, but it doesn't necessarily absolutely suggest that those particular species are most at risk. So the next phase really is, as you describe, is looking at dispersal capabilities or dispersal kernels, the natural dispersal abilities of species, and further sorting down those species to those that have very low dispersal capabilities and perhaps have a narrow climate niche that aren't so tied to, let's say, an edaphic or soil condition. So certainly that's one element of possible vulnerability or exposure to species.
Yes.
Hello. The question is for William about wood fiber reinforced components. One of the fibers that's interesting is the cellulose nanocrystals, and I would like to know where you see the opportunities and the challenges for those.
Okay, so wood fiber nanocellulose is not in the scope of this project initially, but where we see the application would be in modifying the core polymers to provide different coefficients of thermal expansion, toughness, and other attributes which would improve the if you will, the matrix, not the reinforcement. So this technology is 100% focusing on fairly large volume fractions of wood fiber in the final composite, meaning on the order of 50%. And NCC, I think, has an enormous opportunity going forward relative to modifying resin systems to adapt its behavior. Our challenges that we see right now are mostly in the area of dispersion technology, understanding how to integrate or disperse different dispersion, I think. Dispersion of the NCCs within the matrix itself.
And toward the back there, yep.
Scott, a question for you regarding your work in restoration activities and monitoring restoration activities of the forested areas and surveying the caribou migration patterns. Have you ever considered using unmanned aerial systems for observation purposes and tracking purposes?
Actually, that's a good question. There's two elements to that. One I didn't describe, but we are using LiDAR, so existing remote sensing, high-resolution remote sensing information that maps the canopy and forest stand, so we can look at areas without actually actively going in the field and measuring the vegetation height and trees and so on, which is fairly time-consuming over the broad spans of the areas we're working on. So we're using LiDAR to figure out areas that are recovering or not, understand what types of features in the landscape that promote natural recovery versus promote that arrested succession state, and then given that, target the restoration actions. And we've just been starting to use unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, and drone-type UAVs where we can send on missions to send down seismic lines or map well pads and for reclamation purposes. So I think that has a lot of opportunities. It's much more of a small scale type thing, but they can be used every year or every 5 years, and they can actually monitor vegetation recovery on some of these places where it's important to restore.
And this will be the last question for this round, please.
Scott, in measuring biodiversity, are you also looking at the metadata, the microorganisms below the soil? Anybody capturing that?
Not myself, so I don't know the answer to that question. I think in general, not much is done in that area, so it certainly is an area of future possibility. Currently, the public puts a lot of value into some of the more charismatic species, flowering plants and large mammals and things like that. So there's pressure to sustain populations and the viability of species like caribou, but not much work that I know is being done in the boreal forest on that topic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both.